Hello! Today I'm returning to Final Fantasy VII with a look at its curiously evolving legacy within game discourses, game culture, and game history. Now, jumping right in, Final Fantasy VII is a game of firsts in many respects, and starting off with some historical context, from the outset of its release in 1997, it was a game that challenged and changed ideas about what a Final Fantasy could be, and what an RPG could be, and while some people, I think rightly, choose to critique and question the legacies of certain art, media and literature, and why we elevate some and not others in terms of legacy and reputation, it's prudent to note what Final Fantasy VII really did to upend existing notions and perceptions of the RPG, and specifically the JRPG genre. So first off, it's worth noting that Final Fantasy VII wasn't the first JRPG to exist on the Sony PlayStation, and yet such is its enduring appeal, it has in many ways eclipsed what came before it. But early examples, such as 1995's Beyond the Beyond and Suikoden, debuted within a year of the PlayStation's release. We had Squaresoft's own Chrono Trigger being released in 1996, and others, such as the fantastic Wild Arms, also being released in 96, which brought involved storytelling and a bold stab at 3D combat to the fore. And I think many of these games are notable casualties of Final Fantasy VII's success in a lot of ways, which particularly through the passage of time, the game's 1997 release seems to have obscured the chronology of pioneering JRPGs, and particularly this transition to the 3D era and the 5th generation console cycle. Another thing to note of this particular time and place is the status of the RPG within gaming culture and gaming communities, such as it existed in the mid-1990s, because where we now live in an era of Final Fantasy releases being hyped to the standards of a Hollywood blockbuster, with the funding to match in a lot of cases. And many AAA titles, whether it's Assassin's Creed and Red Dead Redemption, or The Witcher and Elden Ring, having hybridized their gameplay to a greater or lesser extent with RPG mechanics. Throughout the 1990s, and particularly in the West, RPGs was something of a geeky niche culture within what was already then a geeky niche culture, since gaming was pretty marginal until about the PS2, PS3 sort of era, when they really exploded into the cultural mainstream. But the reason this is relevant when discussing Final Fantasy VII in respect of its legacy and its historicity is that rather than being this highly anticipated success that gamers immediately flocked to, which is this rather rose-tinted image that we've developed of it today, it was actually quite an angst-ridden gamble for Squaresoft at the time, because JRPGs tended to sell quite poorly in Western markets, and despite having plunged millions into advertising the game, giving Sony the rights to publish the game, and successfully generating 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 previews and review scores upon its release, there was a very genuine concern that Final Fantasy VII just wouldn't wash with a Western audience. And I recently read through some old PlayStation magazines, and it's quite amusing to look back and see reviewers in 1997 imploring, begging their readers to try out this game despite the fact it's an RPG. I also recall an interview with Hironobu Sakaguchi, who was discussing Final Fantasy VI, and how that game sold poorly in the West at the time of its initial release. And again, this is another immensely popular Final Fantasy today, so definitely a testament here to the division between East and West gaming inclinations in the 1990s, and I suppose to a lesser extent the lack of marketing and localization efforts that may have hampered them when they were being ported. And just to conclude on this point, I think the emerging generation of gamers in the late 1990s, the late 90s, early noughts kids may have accounted for this demographic shift towards JRPGs too. And I think I've mentioned before, but my personal introduction to the series was Final Fantasy VII. But rather than having read reviews or bought the game myself because I was far too young, it was given to me by a family member who would have been in their mid-20s, I think, in 1997, and where they'd maybe not cared enough to keep the game because they gave it to me, and to be honest, I can't really remember why they gave it to me. But for my part, I was fascinated by it, and although my first impression was something along the lines of, wow, this is nothing like Sonic the Hedgehog or Crash Bandicoot, the uniqueness of the JRPG format, the storytelling, the concept art, the backgrounds and the music, and all of that sort of stuff, this was fascinating to me as a child, and perhaps a lot of young kids who engaged with Final Fantasy VII may have felt this way, and are in part what gave this second wind and revival to the RPG and the JRPG genre that saw its popularity and mechanics proliferate the way they did into the present day and the present mechanics that we see in gaming today. But personal anecdotes aside, and wrapping up on the initial release of the game, Final Fantasy VII was also momentous in other important ways. Famously, it was the series' transition to Sony from a long-standing relationship with Nintendo. It was the series' transition to disc rather than cartridge technology, which initiated, in part, that change from Nintendo. And it was the series' transition to polygonal 3D over the top-down tile sets and pixel art that had dictated the JRPG up to this time. So again, numerous other things that marked its milestone transition from what came before it into this new world and the fifth generation. And so, despite the reluctance towards RPGs at the time, by the nature of Final Fantasy VII's production alone, irrespective of the actual contents of the game, which I will come to, it was a historically significant release within the realms of the JRPG and the wider chronology of gaming. And actually, I've been playing a bit of Chrono Trigger and a bit of Wild Arms lately, and the difference between other JRPGs and Final Fantasy VII in terms of gameplay, aesthetics, and so on is night and day, really. And it's only by really looking back, looking at comparable titles at the time, that we can really see how unique and how different Final Fantasy VII was in terms of its production. So this reputation on that alone is rightly earned, I think. Now, coming on to the changing legacy of Final Fantasy VII, its evolution over time in terms of narrative and content, but also how audiences have reacted and evolved with what has been an interesting, sometimes divisive, and wholly unique thing to see in the Final Fantasy anthology, because while a few Final Fantasies, such as 10, 12, and 13, have serialized, none have done so to quite the sprawling multimedia extent as Final Fantasy VII, which has inched back into prequel material and also forwards into sequels. So an entire universe has built up around the original game to the extent that Final Fantasy VII has become a franchise unto itself. And really, while many were surprised at the announcement of an Advent Children movie, and later Before Crisis and that sort of thing back in the day, if we consider that Final Fantasy VII was a top 5 best-selling PlayStation game, and that other best-selling PlayStation games, such as Metal Gear Solid, Tomb Raider, Crash Bandicoot, were all met subsequently with sequel installments that were money-making bestsellers too, I suppose we can appreciate why many at Squaresoft might have been keen to expand on Final Fantasy VII in particular, despite Hironobu Sakaguchi's former stewardship demanding that they should all be self-contained stories and self-contained entries. So, looking to the shifting legacy of the game, personally the way that I categorise Final Fantasy VII's evolution is unpacking Square's compilation into 3 key phases, which is Final Fantasy VII's debut release in 1997, Final Fantasy VII's first expansion into what now is called the compilation, which was in the mid-2000s, which encompasses Before Crisis, Advent Children in 2004, up to Crisis Core in 2007. And then we have the third and current phase, which is the Remake era, and I would include Ever Crisis and that sort of thing in this period too. And I think each of these has significantly shifted the narrative, the perceptions, and the legacy of Final Fantasy VII in weird and interesting ways. So, first off, looking back to the first game and how we consider it today, and something one of my patrons mentioned in a message to me that got me really thinking, and I suppose was the impetus for this episode in a lot of ways, is whether or not we'd consider Final Fantasy VII as a political game, whether it was intended as a political game, and whether it's become political through the passage of time. And that observation really struck me when taking a step back and looking at the changing demographics of gaming, how we talk about games, and the wider world. And what I mean by that is, since its initial release in 1997, and baked into the premise of Final Fantasy VII's story, has always been this planet in crisis narrative. The concept of Mako being the pure, natural and necessary lifeblood of the planet upon which it survives, which is being sucked from the ground by the morally bankrupt, money-grabbing corporation Shinra. And it's interesting to consider this because, looking at Final Fantasy VII today, you can find countless articles and essays deconstructing this supposed political allegory within the game, and how it was a tour de force in 1997 as this scathing reproach of unbridled capitalism and so on and so forth. But really, I think what's interesting about these articles and these sorts of discourses is how they are more a reflection of today's culture as opposed to how things were almost 30 years ago. Because while I think, yes, there is a correlation of Mako and fossil fuels and Shinra to energy companies, I think it was a clear and consciously written one to some degree. But firstly, the plundering and consumption of natural resources at the expense of the natural world never used to be a politically charged message, but more of a poignant scientific and educational one, the likes of which we see in Studio Ghibli films, sci-fi literature through the 20th century, which was rife with this sort of backdrop and setting. And I think although the Overton window of political dispute has shifted dramatically towards environmentalism, energy production and climate change in recent years, and rightly so, but I don't think this retrospectively means that Final Fantasy VII was a game created with political intent. And indeed, I'd support that by suggesting if we look at the wider oeuvre of Final Fantasy game narratives, they all hinge in one way or another on a conflict between the natural world and some industrializing technological force, such as the Gestalian Empire harvesting espers in Final Fantasy VI, and that sort of thing. And I think in a way, these games and this theme of nature versus technology, the spiritual versus technology, or indeed tradition versus technology, reflects the fact that the series is Japanese more than anything else, or as much as anything else, because Japan is a country that's very much stuck between old and new, and has been for a very long time, and it had this spurt of rapid industrialization in the 20th century, and became this technological powerhouse, but it was ultimately hampered by its traditions and its refusal to modernize in other essential ways, which are contributing today to its economic decline, its population decline, and so on. So clear conflicts here between old and new, feudal and modern, spiritual and modern, that whether consciously or not, I think may account for some of these themes that recur in Final Fantasy games. And it's simply a case that Final Fantasy VII wraps this conflict in a world that's slightly more relatable than most. I'd also suggest that if Final Fantasy VII really was trying to make a political point upon its release, then its legacy to this end has been undermined over time, particularly looking at entries such as the compilation novel On the Way to a Smile, because the solution our team of freedom fighters arrive at for replacing Mako is that rather than exploring wind or hydro or solar power or any other sort of renewable that a political game might suggest, Barrett Wallace and the denizens of Midgar, they start mining for oil instead, which completely undermines any real-world allegories for fossil fuel production that the title might have originally had. Now, that said, and looking at how Final Fantasy VII has evolved over the years, there's definitely a case to suggest that it has inadvertently become political, or at least politicized to modern audiences, for numerous reasons. First off, as mentioned, the climate crisis is on the news agenda, and the recent release of Final Fantasy VII Remake, this planet-depleting story, has very much chimed with the cultural political moment. But more so than that, the world today is more politically polarised than it has been, certainly in my lifetime, not just on economic and social standards, because fundamentally, of course, left-right politics is about who controls the means of production and that sort of thing, but it's also seeped into pop culture and cultural dialogue too, with games being very much a part of that. And if you go back and look at game magazines and game forums of the 1990s, the early 2000s, you'd be hard-pushed to find political commentary of the like that we see today around Final Fantasy, or indeed any title that I can think of. And I think the extent of debate was the Cloud Tifa Aerith thing, which has been going on since the game's release, although it was much less vitriolic at the time, because mostly in forums you were just happy to be around and have found other Final Fantasy fans. So really, I think games in the real world were very much separate at the time of Final Fantasy VII's release, and it's only recently that gap has sort of closed. So the game has become politicised, but I don't think it's political, if that makes sense. Now, with that said, and as an example I suppose, looking at the changing legacy, it's been pointed out that the Final Fantasy VII Remake seems more politically charged than the original title, and people have cited, for example, the renewed and constant use of the term terrorist to describe Avalanche, which was very much the buzzword of the first decade of the 2000s, politically speaking. You know, we had the Bush-era war on terror, for example, and anyone growing up in that period would reasonably have political connotations with that word. And I did actually go back and check the original game, where Avalanche is mostly referred to as an underground resistance movement, insofar as it's described at all, which is more in keeping with the series traditions and these nods to Star Wars, for example, where we have a benevolent resistance movement fighting against an evil empire. But I did actually find one use of the word terrorist in the original PS1 game, which is an NPC character right after the first reactor by Seventh Heaven, who describes Avalanche as a terrorist group. But really, I think rather than being a political or consciously using political connotations in the remake, I'd actually put this terminology and stuff like this down to three key things. The first is more considered and specific localization, which was absent in the first game. The second being that the entire first remake installment takes place in Midgar, so it's very much hinged on that dispute between Avalanche and Shinra, and they really needed and I suppose wanted to unpack and explore the nuance and the conflict between these two groups, and the perception of these two groups to the general public and the populace of Midgar, who are obviously the majority of the NPCs we interact with, who would be affected by, you know, these reactor bombing missions and stuff like that. So it was an important subtextual role in this first installment. And finally, I think the most important reason at the heart of this episode is precisely the evolution of the game story that's been taking place since the first Final Fantasy game, and has created this shifting perspective and legacy of the game when we look at the compilation material. And what I mean by that, and shifting into story and characters now, is that in Final Fantasy VII proper, we are generally of the belief that we are the good guys, and we are fighting against the bad guys. And although a couple of the NPCs in Midgar complain about Avalanche, and Jessie, for example, questions her actions early on, it's quite a clear-cut thing in the mind of the player that Shinra is evil, ergo we are the heroes. But when they chose to serialize and sequelize Final Fantasy VII, starting with Before Crisis and later Crisis Core, which focused on the story of the Turks and Zack, Square seemed to notice that indulging these popular characters who are members of Shinra meant that, by contrast, Avalanche, and to a lesser extent Wutai, needed to be positioned as a slightly more dubious group. And I think arriving at the remake, efforts have been made to paint Final Fantasy VII's various factions in shades of grey, rather than this very stark good versus bad that we saw in the original game. For example, Zack Fair is clearly an optimistic and positive guy, but he's also a Shinra soldier first class, so that needs to be balanced with the perception of the forces he's fighting against. The Turks, Reno, Rude and Sung, are also now shown to have some degree of moral compass about them, rather than the generally amoral, villainous, if humorous characterization of them in the original game. And Avalanche is shown to have various infighting factions within it in the remake universe, which may serve to try and create this idea of a good Avalanche and a bad Avalanche, just as Zack might represent good Shinra as opposed to bad Shinra. So there's much more shades of grey at work here, which I think comes with the territory of sequelizing and expanding the universe of this title, and exploring the stories with these Shinra-allied characters in particular. And to be fair to Square, they have, for the most part, simply dialed up and expanded on the nuance and characterizations that were already there in the original game. Reno and the Turks are a prime example. Sung's relationship to Aerith is hinted at in the original game. It's just not really expanded upon in his personality or perspective. Reno and Rude are likewise often comical and questionable in their commitment to actually being bad people in the original game. But once more, this is just dialed up, foremost in Advent Children, but then much more in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which seems to amalgamate their characterization of the original game and Advent Children. So we see much more personality shine through, although there were some fundamental changes, such as showing Rude as a bit more of a talkative character, which is contrary to his initial appearance in 1997. And even tertiary incidental characters, such as Johnny, who's a character who can be glimpsed around Midgar in the original Final Fantasy VII and has an infatuation with Tifa. Now, thanks to the sequels and thanks to the remake, he has much more personality and weirdly involvement in segments of the gameplay story in Remake, which I suppose attests to Square needing to expand the Midgar segment across the entire game. So a lot more characterization happening across the board here. And this is interesting to consider, and I suppose has positives and negatives attributable to it. Because first off, looking at the cast in its entirety, something I've mentioned in the past is how all the Final Fantasy games prior to Final Fantasy X permitted or indeed demanded a degree of imagination on the part of the player, because there was no advanced idiosyncratic character movements or models or behaviours. There was no voice acting and stuff like that. And thus it was left to us, the player, to consider what Cloud Strife or Reno or Tifa or whoever might sound like when they spoke, how they moved, how they acted, and all of these subtleties and nuances of their personality and identity. And this is in part why I'm so interested to see how the more abstract characters, such as Bugenhagen, will be rendered in the later games. But with the improved technology of the remake, with the movie Advent Children, a lot of these early abstractions of character were clarified and fleshed out and taken out of the player's hands, for good or ill, depending on how you perceive the progression of Final Fantasy VII. And for example, beyond seeing simply Cloud's core interactions with Barrett and these dialogues about not caring about Avalanche and the planet and so on, we now see the full spectrum of Cloud and his micro-interactions and his micro-discussions, these dialogue barks and incidental moments during battle, during victories, and simply running around the world, dealing with shopkeepers and NPCs. Everything about his personality and his relationship to and reaction to the world around him is embellished to a much greater degree. And for my part, I think Cloud, along with Aerith, Tifa, Barrett, the Turks, and indeed most of the legacy characters, despite the necessity of being characterised beyond what we'd previously seen of them, I think it's been done pretty faithfully to their original conception. So Cloud's juxtaposing detached nonchalance and occasional goofiness is carried through well, albeit with slightly more smugness in some of his retorts than in the original game. Barrett's outraged but amusing arguments with Cloud have been carried through, and the Turks' fundamental amoral villainy is all there. But as I say, I think it's simply been heightened thanks to the development of the technology and the embellishment of the game world. Now, in keeping with characters, I think perhaps the biggest shift in Final Fantasy VII's legacy and our perception of the game today, as opposed to it was in the late 90s, early 2000s, is how it's progressively building on peripheral characters that never had much stake or purpose in the original game story. I've mentioned Johnny as one example, who features considerably more in the remake, and beyond that we have Biggs, Wedge, Jesse of Avalanche, who, irrespective of the shifting timeline that has now revealed their improbable survival, makes them a much larger part of Cloud's story than was originally depicted. But certainly the biggest shift in Final Fantasy VII over the years has been the role of Zack Fair, and to a lesser extent that of Sephiroth. And I suppose this is where the argument for nuance, subtlety, and the unknown comes to the fore, because I've long been someone that doesn't mind the unexplained, providing the unexplained doesn't hamper or render the core story incoherent. And so I felt that Zack Fair's role and brief appearances in the 1997 game were an intriguing mystery that it was left for the player to wonder about, but overall he worked primarily in the service of Cloud's story and as a vehicle through which we learn about and eventually understand Cloud's identity crisis and his muddled personality. So for me at the time, that was the extent of Zack's purpose in the original game, and that was fine. Now, coming to that initial compilation phase in the early 2000s, a lot of the media, including Advent Children, either teased or directly focused on Zack's inclusion to the Final Fantasy VII saga. And indeed, I think most of the media, excluding maybe Dirge of Cerberus, did depict him to some degree or another. And of course the biggest release of that period was Crisis Core, which was very much Zack's story. This is interesting because it initiated this slight schism in the Final Fantasy VII saga, where the significance of Cloud and Cloud's story is, I wouldn't say undermined or necessarily diluted, but it's certainly sharing the spotlight with Zack Fair now, and even prior to the newer remake material, which is reimagining or sequelizing a timeline showing Zack's survival, the legacy of Crisis Core for many players was that it became much harder to imagine the events of Final Fantasy VII proper without seeing how the long shadow of Zack's legacy was being cast over events. And for example, Cloud's interactions with Aerith now seem like this weird facsimile of Zack's interactions, and Cloud's mercenary demeanour, his wielding of the Buster Sword, and all of this stuff attesting to his muddled personality, which was simply nuance in 1997, has become irrevocably associated with Zack Fair in the wake of Crisis Core. And it will be interesting to see how this is navigated, because they've boldly opted to feature Zack alongside Cloud in the remake games. Because it's easy to see, I think, how they could have coexisted as protagonists in two separate timelines if they were kept apart, but by bringing them together, it's going to prove a major upheaval and yet another evolution, I think, in the legacy of Final Fantasy VII and the changing perceptions of this story since 1997, where perhaps, rather than Cloud Strife being the face of the franchise, it will shift even more into a deuteragonist or ensemble sort of story as Zack becomes more prominent. Turning also to the central villain and the ever-popular Sephiroth, I would argue the same thing about his role shifting in the minds of the player over time, because where there's little dispute that his original impact and repute was built on the fact there was so little sight of him in the original game, and we spent the first several hours travelling in the wake of Sephiroth, rather than seeing him or interacting with him, which gave this immense mystique and building intrigue to who this elusive soldier might be. Once again, this has been rehashed and reimagined in subsequent titles, starting with this first phase of the compilation, such as Crisis Core, where he was explored a little bit more, but retained this certain unknowability about his thoughts and feelings. But looking to the remake, many, I think rightly, noted that Sephiroth appearing pretty much immediately undermined his mystique in this new entry, particularly for new players who might be coming to this title for the first time. But upon replaying the game, I also found that his taunts and his dialogues with Cloud also shift our perception of him, because he rather vindictively discusses murdering Cloud's mother, and this is quite personal and spiteful sorts of dialogue, which the Sephiroth of 1997, who was more concerned with becoming a god and owning the planet, and he never would have concerned himself with this sort of vindictiveness and vitriol, I suppose. Now, clearly, being a sequel, and particularly one that shows Sephiroth having a certain awareness of prior events and Meteor Fall and so on, the game was under no obligation to replicate his original depiction. And indeed, with this prior awareness, Sephiroth clearly sees Cloud as a much more significant foil to him than in the original game. But as a result, it's definitely shifted the perception of his character from this mysterious, sparsely speaking character, and indeed also quite a sympathetic character in his original outing, to one who is perhaps more a directly vengeful entity when it comes to Cloud Strife. But naturally, any other comments at this stage would just be conjecture, and it remains to be seen how much they continue to evolve and change Sephiroth's demeanour. But I'd also finally say that the Ever Crisis decision to show events of young Sephiroth will further change our perception of him too, and whether that's a sympathetic portrayal or a villainous portrayal or simply an objective biographical depiction, it will certainly dispel some of the mysteries that surround his origins and reshape, for good or ill, what we think of him. So, overall, interesting stuff going on with respect to the cast of Final Fantasy VII and how they continue to change over time as the compilation universe expands. And aside from changes in gameplay and all of that mechanical stuff, and the changes in the audience, how we perceive and interact with games, I would say that fundamentally what shifted the legacy of Final Fantasy VII the most, and how we understand and reflect on the story, including retrospectively the 1997 game, which is of course still canonical and still necessary in this renewed focus on the game story, is this exploration of the backstories and the personalities and the agendas of what were formerly quite fleeting peripheral characters, such as the Turks, Biggs, Wedge, Jesse, but most importantly, I think at this stage in the game, Zack and Sephiroth. And I suppose, yes, other new inclusions, such as the soldier Roche, seem to be embellishing the story and contributing perhaps to this idea of, good Shinra, bad Shinra that I mentioned earlier. But to what extent they're really going to move the dial when it comes to the macro story and our overall perception and reaction to Final Fantasy VII, I would tentatively argue at this point that in the scheme of things, they won't move it that much. I can't see Roach becoming a super major character that's going to shift things at this stage, although we never really know. But there we have it, some observations and impressions about how Final Fantasy VII stands today versus almost 30 years ago, how we've changed as an audience as much as the game itself, and perhaps how it will continue to change as more releases such as the Remake, Ever Crisis, and later installments contribute and build upon the foundations of this title from 1997. If you got this far, thanks for listening, I hope you enjoyed it. And please consider sharing, subscribing, and checking out the description below to find out how you can support the channel.